Hi, everybody. This is Mark Newman again from Precision Analytical, the makers of the Dutch test. We just wrapped up, I think, a pretty interesting video series where we're showing you a lot of new and interesting data to try to illuminate truth for you on this complex topic, transdermal testing. When you take transdermal hormones, what happens in the lab test? We know with dosing that people tend to use, the progesterone, the testosterone, the estradiol, they increase a lot in saliva and blood spot, not so much in serum or urine. So what I wanted to do in this video is answer this question. What seems to make the most sense to explain the elevation in saliva and blood spot? So what is actually going on when people take transdermal hormones like progesterone? How in the world do we get these elevated salivary values while the serum and the urine don't tend to respond the same way? I have looked at lots and lots of data on this topic. Here's what makes sense to me. If you drive hormone through the skin into systemic circulation, what do you get? You get a representative amount in serum, saliva, or urine, right? So whether it's testosterone, estradiol, progesterone, if it actually gets into systemic circulation, you should get a representative amount in serum, which is protein bound. That's what's represented there in the serum. You get the free hormone in saliva, and you get a hormone conjugate in urine, more or less representative of how much hormone's getting in there. If you look at injections, for example, of hormones where there isn't this controversy, you get a very similar pattern, up and down in serum, up and down in saliva, up and down in urine. It all makes sense. But when the hormone is driven in to the skin, some of it gets in again, and we see a representative amount. But we don't know exactly how this works, but this is the model that makes sense of most data to me, is you're going to get a migration of hormone somehow. Do I know how? Not exactly. Some lymphatic transport, maybe the subcutaneous fat plays some role in that transport. Somehow the hormone gets from being absorbed partially in the skin into the saliva in much higher concentrations without getting into systemic circulation. Now, some of the data that's helped me to understand that is all I have to do to drive the saliva values higher, I can use a higher dose, right? The other thing I can do is just put it close to the saliva gland. If you take some hormone, you're putting it on your thigh, and you get a saliva value, say, okay, there's my value. And then you take the same dose and you put it on your neck instead of your thigh, that value is going to go way higher. You want it even higher? Put it on your cheeks. Even if the samples aren't contaminated, that diffusion of hormone goes up relative to how close it's applied to the saliva gland, which tells you there's likely some sort of diffusion type behavior going on to get it from being put on the skin and into the saliva, and it's bypassing systemic circulation, which is why if you watch the previous videos, you can put hormones on a person, get super high saliva values, right, and not see any clinical impact until the dose gets high enough that you get it into systemic circulation so that you see it, for example, in urine. Now, in dried blood spot, we get the same thing. So does saliva correlate with anything? What we showed in the last video that it doesn't correlate really with dried blood spots, right? There's not, when you do a one-for-one measurement, and that's only been done in one study, it's not published, but it's pretty interesting data that shows that, they don't really correlate in an overall sense, but they do correlate in the sense that both of those samples are flooded with hormone where serum and urine are not, and the clinical data doesn't seem to follow. Now, why is that? Nobody's really figured out how the hormone gets transported from the skin to the saliva to the dried blood spot without getting elsewhere. The other bit of data that I've found interesting that agrees with this interpretation is there have been several attempts to look at one published and then a lot of unpublished data that says if you take a bunch of topical progesterone, your saliva goes way up, right? What happens when you stop taking the topical progesterone? If you've taken it for a long time, I've seen data where the values are elevated for more than 6 months. So think about that. Why is that? Likely there's some sort of fat-soluble fat reservoir of progesterone that the saliva gland continues to have access to. So saliva, I think, has special access to fat-soluble hormones, even if they're not getting into systemic circulation. The data is most consistent with that interpretation Then the interpretation, which is the alternate interpretation that is offered by people, which is that saliva represents tissue. So if you think about the brain, you think about bone, but bone's a good example, right? What we don't see bone increase with estrogen use until serum goes up out of the postmenopausal range and urine goes up out of the postmenopausal range. And at the doses for creams and gel, well, I should say gels. Creams have not been studied for bone mineral density change or any clinical change. So we have to look at gels. With gels that show very, very elevated saliva values, unless the serum values go up and out of the postmenopausal range, urine values up and out of the postmenopausal range, you don't see the clinical impact. So sometimes finding truth on these topics begins with ruling out what is not true. And I think we have these competing ideas that these values are very different. They're discordant, right? Saliva and blood spot are going way up. Serum and urine for testosterone and estradiol are going up in a linear dose dependent manner, but at a much lesser degree than either saliva or blood spot. So it's really complicated to ask ourselves what is true, which one is right, which one agrees with the clinical data. It's actually a little easier, which is one of the reasons I made this series of videos. It's a little easier to dig through that data and find what is not consistent. And what's not consistent is the clinical data that you see at different doses of these hormones and the elevation you see in saliva and blood spot. The previous videos that I made in this series go through some really interesting and some of it brand new, compelling data that helps us to understand that the model of saying that saliva represents tissue when you're on transdermal hormone, is that true or not? I think we can conclude with a lot of confidence that that's not true. Salivary cortisol, absolutely true. Represents tissue value. The literature is there to support the use of monitoring cortisol in saliva. Monitoring other hormones in saliva when you're not on therapy also can give you decent data as long as your analytical work is good and solid, which is really tough with estradiol because the hormone's so low. So is there potential to use saliva for monitoring hormones? Yes. But when you switch into a world where the hormone is applied by a cream or a gel, you get special access to fat stored hormones. That's my interpretation of what's going on in saliva. And it has basically nothing, no correlation with the clinical impact that we see from now dozens and dozens of studies on testosterone and estradiol, especially, that show us which doses work. And when those doses work, we know that the salivary values and the dried blood spot values are elevated to levels that do not correlate with clinical reality. So I hope you found this series helpful. Again, if you have data that's interesting, if you have questions on this topic, we love to dialogue on this topic, and we will continue to explore the truth and reality of the clinical data as it relates to hormone replacement therapy and its monitoring, and we look forward to continuing that conversation with you.